They weren't supposed to touch it. The Willis Jeep stood there, still warm from the last American who'd driven it. A soldier now lying in the mud 50 meters away. But Hans couldn't resist. For a German mechanic who'd spent years fixing clunky Opel Blitz trucks, this machine looked like something from the future. October 1942, somewhere near El Alamein, North Africa. The air shimmered with heat and diesel fumes. Dust clung to everything, boots, uniforms, even thoughts. The 21st Panzer Division had captured a small British supply column 2 days earlier, and among the wreckage stood the strange little vehicle with U.S. Army painted on its hood. Hans Becker, 23, adjusted his mechanic's cap and circled the Jeep like a wolf around prey. "Look at this, Dieter," he said to his friend, a tall corporal with sand-colored stubble. "It's beautiful, compact, balanced. It's like engineered joy." Dieter snorted. "Engineered joy? You sound like Goebbels describing the Führer's car." Hans laughed, but his eyes didn't leave the machine. The steering wheel, the clutch, everything looked simple, efficient, almost friendly. It was a kind of engineering that wasn't about domination or power, but about practicality and speed. Something Germany had forgotten in its obsession with complexity. A shadow fell across them. It was their sergeant, Otto Voss, a thick man with a scar cutting across his cheek. "Becker, what are you doing?" Otto balked. "Just checking the vehicle. Her Feldwebel." Hans replied quickly. "It's enemy property. Leave it. We'll burn it before nightfall." Hans hesitated. "Sir, if I could inspect it, maybe we can use it for supply runs. The fuel lines look intact. Engine's fine. Are you deaf, Becker? I said leave it." But that night, when the desert wind began to howl and the stars came out cold and sharp, Hans couldn't resist. He sneaked out from his tent with a wrench and a lantern. The Jeep started on the second try. The purr of the American engine was unlike anything he'd heard. Smooth, eager, almost alive. Dieter appeared behind him, sleepy-eyed but grinning. "You're insane," Dieter said. "Maybe," Hans replied, "but listen to her. Doesn't she sound free?" They drove in circles around the encampment, laughing like boys. Even in wartime, under the endless African sky, for 5 minutes, they weren't soldiers. They were just two young mechanics chasing the thrill of something forbidden. The next morning, Otto found out, and Hans spent 3 hours digging latrines under the blazing sun. The Afrika Korps was retreating. Supplies ran thin. Fuel was life. When a sandstorm cut off one of their forward repair units, Otto had no choice but to send a small recovery team. And guess which vehicle he chose? The Jeep. Hans grinned when Otto tossed him the keys. "Try not to get us killed," the sergeant muttered. "Wouldn't dream of it," Hans said. They drove across the desert. Hans at the wheel, Dieter beside him, and a young radio operator named Klaus in the back. The sand was endless. The sun merciless. The world felt empty except for the sound of the Jeep's American engine and the thought that somewhere out there, the British were regrouping. By nightfall, they reached a destroyed convoy, their own. The smell of burned oil and blood mixed with the dry air. Among the wreckage were German helmets, torn letters, and the remains of what had once been a Panzer III. Klaus found a photo in the sand, a family portrait. "They didn't stand a chance," he whispered. Hans didn't answer. He was staring at the Jeep's dashboard. The American speedometer glowed faintly in the moonlight. Miles, not kilometers. It made him think how strange that men could die over such small differences. On their way back, they spotted movement on the ridge. "Stop!" Dieter hissed. 3 silhouettes appeared, British scouts, rifles aimed. Hans froze. The Jeep's engine idled quietly, like a heartbeat. For a long second, no one moved. Then a voice called out from the ridge. "Hold your fire. That's one of ours." The British soldiers hesitated. The Jeep had fooled them. Its silhouette was too familiar. Hans slowly pressed the clutch. Dieter's eyes widened. Don't. If they get closer. But it was too late. The Jeep lunged forward, sand spraying behind it. Bullets tore through the night. When it was over, one British scout lay dead, another wounded. Hans's hands were shaking on the wheel. Dieter stared at him. You didn't have to. They would have killed us, Hans said quietly. Klaus was silent, staring at the American stars still painted on the hood. The same stars the dead soldier had once fought for. For the first time, Hans felt ashamed of touching the Jeep. The next morning, the desert was silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, like the world itself was holding its breath. Hans, Dieter, and Klaus rolled back into camp just after dawn. The Jeep was covered in dust, a streak of dried blood across the fender. Otto Voss stood waiting, arms crossed, cigarette trembling slightly between his fingers. "Where's the recovery unit?" he asked. Hans hesitated. "Gone, sir. Ambushed. We found no survivors." Otto's eyes went cold. "And the British?" Hans swallowed. "3. We engaged." "Engaged," Otto repeated flatly. His gaze slid over the Jeep, the blood, the bullet holes, the American star still visible on the hood. "Get this thing out of my sight." But the Jeep stayed. They couldn't burn it now. It was too useful. The German trucks were unreliable, fuel-hungry monsters, while the American machine ran like it was born from the sand itself. It became their supply vehicle, their ambulance, their escape car when things went wrong. To Hans, that Jeep became both a blessing and a curse. Every time he touched the steering wheel, he could almost hear the echo of gunfire in the night, and see the body of the British scout who'd called out, thinking they were friends. A week later, Hans sat behind a tent, writing a letter by candlelight. He wrote to his mother back in Hamburg about the heat, the dust, the endless desert. But he didn't mention the Jeep. He didn't mention the boy he'd killed. He didn't mention the way his hands still shook at night. "Don't stay up worrying," he wrote. "We're fine here. The Americans build good engines, that's all." Dieter appeared, tossing a canteen onto the table. "Riding home again?" Hans nodded. "Tell her we'll win by Christmas." Hans forced a smile. "I'd rather not lie to her." Dieter sat down, exhaling. "You think too much, Hans. You always have. This is war. You fix machines. You keep us alive. That's enough." But Hans didn't look convinced. His eyes drifted toward the Jeep, parked in the distance, half covered in sand. Its headlights looked almost like eyes, watching them in the dark. On November 2nd, the Battle of El Alamein reached them like a storm. Artillery shook the ground for miles. The British pushed forward with tanks and planes. The German lines collapsed one by one. Hans was under a burning sky, fixing a damaged half-track when Otto shouted, "We're pulling back. Becker, take the Jeep. Load the wounded." Within minutes, the Jeep was full. 2 wounded men in the back, Klaus on a radio, Dieter beside Hans. They drove through chaos. Explosions, fire, screams. British Spitfires strafed the road, bullets cracking the sand like whips. At one point, the Jeep's windshield shattered. Hans ducked, heart pounding, but the engine kept running, smooth, defiant. "She doesn't die easy," Dieter yelled, gripping the dashboard. "Neither do we," Hans shouted back. They reached a ruined gas station miles from the front and hid behind the cracked walls. The air reeked of oil and cordite. Dieter lit a cigarette with trembling hands. "We should have burned this damn thing when we had the chance." Hans looked at him sharply. "Don't say that." "Why not?" "Because it saved us. Dieter exhalet smolka." "Yeah, and it killed others." They both went quiet. In the distance, the desert glowed orange. The German army retreating, their empire collapsing under the weight of sand and steel. 2 days later, while scavenging fuel near an abandoned British outpost, they found a man alive. He was lying beside a wrecked truck, uniform torn, leg bandaged with a bloody strip of cloth. His dog tags read Private Daniel Moore, U.S. Army. The man lifted his head weakly as they approached. "Don't shoot," he rasped. Klaus aimed his rifle. Hans raised a hand. "Wait." Otto ordered, "Leave him. We can't waste supplies." But Hans couldn't. "He's dying. Let me at least give him water." The sergeant glared. "Water is for us." Hans stared back, silent but unyielding. Finally, Otto spat in the sand. "Fine. 1 minute." Hans knelt beside the American, lifting his head gently. The man drank greedily, coughing between gulps. His accent was soft, almost kind. "You drive that jeep?" he asked weakly. Hans froze. "Yes." The American's eyes flicked toward it. "She belonged to my unit." "Good machine, huh?" Hans didn't answer. He couldn't. The man smiled faintly. "Take care of her. She'll get you home." He died before sunset. That night, Hans sat alone in the jeep, engine off, staring at the stars. He placed the dog tags on the dashboard. Private Daniel Moore. The man who'd built it, driven it, maybe even laughed inside it. Now Hans sat where he once had. An enemy, a thief, a survivor. Days later, they reached Tunis. The retreat had turned into chaos. Soldiers wandered without orders. Fuel was gone. Morale was dust. Hans parked the jeep beside a convoy of wounded men. Dieter approached, face hollow, voice quiet. "We made it. Somehow," Hans nodded. "Yeah, thanks to her." Dieter glanced at the jeep. "She's more American than we are German now." Hans smiled sadly. "Maybe that's a good thing." Later that night, in a half-destroyed town, Hans went to find Otto. The sergeant sat alone, cleaning his pistol. "Herr Feldwebel." Hans began, voice trembling slightly. "I need to say something." Otto looked up, unimpressed. "If it's about the jeep." "It is," Hans interrupted. "It's cursed." Otto raised an eyebrow. "Cursed? You sound like a priest." "I'm serious. Everyone who's touched it is still alive." Otto cut in. "You think we'd have made it across the desert in a broken opal? That machine kept us breathing." Hans looked down. "At what cost?" The sergeant sighed, lighting another cigarette. "Becker, in this war the only curse is thinking too much." But Hans couldn't stop thinking. Every night, the engine's hum haunted him, even when it wasn't running, like the ghost of Private Moore whispering through the gears. He knew the war was ending for them, and he knew, deep down, that the jeep would outlive them all. The wind in Tunis carried the smell of salt and smoke. By May of 1943, the Afrika Korps was collapsing. The Allies were closing in from all directions, and a once proud German army was now a collection of starving, exhausted men trying to hold a line that no longer existed. Hans Becker woke before dawn. The desert sky above was dark purple, and the horizon flickered with distant fire. He sat in the jeep, the American jeep, and listened to the steady click of cooling metal. Even when the engine slept, it seemed alive, like something breathing beneath the hood. Dieter climbed in beside him, rubbing his eyes. "Can't sleep again?" Hans shook his head. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear it running." Dieter smoked tiredly. At least something's still running. Behind them, the camp was falling apart. Men burning documents, destroying equipment, burying ammunition. They all knew what was coming. Surrender. At midday, Sergeant Otto Voss gathered the remnants of his unit. His uniform was torn, his face dark with dust and fatigue. "High Command has ordered us to hold this road until further instruction," he announced, voice hollow. Klaus let out a bitter laugh. "Further instruction? From who? Berlin? They don't even remember we exist." Otto ignored him. "We'll fight until the last bullet." Hans looked around. They had maybe 20 men, half of them wounded, and not enough ammo for one firefight. He said quietly, "Sir, we should surrender. The Americans treat prisoners well." Otto glared at him. "You want to raise your hands? After all this?" "I want to live," Hans said simply. The sergeant turned away, muttering something about cowards. But Hans noticed the tremor in his hands as he reloaded his pistol. That night, Hans and Dieter were sent to scout the southern road, the last route that wasn't yet cut off. They drove the jeep under a moonless sky, headlights off, guided only by the stars and the faint glow of distant fires. For hours, they said nothing. Finally, Dieter broke the silence. "You ever think about what happens after?" Hans kept his eyes on the road. "After what?" "After we lose. After we go home." Hans gave a soft, bitter laugh. "If we go home." They reached a ridge overlooking the valley and froze. Below them, hundreds of American vehicles stretched into the desert, engines humming softly. The invasion was complete. "Looks like the end," Dieter said quietly. Hans nodded. "Yeah." Then, for no reason he could explain, Hans turned the jeep off and just sat there, listening to the silence between them, the silence before the storm. At dawn, the first American patrol reached their position. Hans and Dieter were surrounded before they even realized it. Rifles aimed from every direction. A tall officer with a southern accent stepped forward. "Drop your weapons, boys. It's over." Otto's voice came faintly from the radio. "Hold your ground." But Hans didn't move. He slowly raised his hands. Dieter followed. The American officer nodded. "Smart move." As they were escorted back toward the camp, Hans saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Among the Allied convoy was another jeep, almost identical to theirs. Same model, same color, same worn seats. But this one carried an American flag fluttering in the breeze. Hans stared at it, then looked back at his own, the one covered in dust and bullet holes, still marked with the faint star beneath the German paint. Two identical machines, one symbol of victory, one symbol of defeat. And yet, both had done the same thing, carried men across hell. At the prisoner camp near Bizerta, the Americans lined them up, checked their papers, and assigned them tents. Hans found himself sitting on the ground, staring at the jeep through the wire fence. It was parked near the guards' quarters, freshly cleaned, its hood open as mechanics checked the engine. An American soldier walked over, chewing gum. He was young, maybe 20, with sunburned skin and kind eyes. "You the one who drove that thing?" he asked. Hans hesitated. "Yes." "Runs like a dream." "Huh?" "Built to last." Hans nodded slowly. "It did." The American crouched beside him, resting his arms on his knees. "Funny thing, my brother's in the 101st drives one, just like it in Italy. Guess you Germans got good taste." Hans gave a tired smile. "It wasn't ours to begin with." The American shrugged. "Nothing's anyone's out here." "Not really." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind whistled through the camp's barbed wire, carrying the distant sound of trucks and engines. The war still moving, even if for them it was already over. Weeks passed. The prisoners built roads, carried crates, wrote letters that would never reach home. Hans kept glancing toward the jeep whenever he could, now used by the Americans again, as if the desert itself had chosen who would drive it next. He remembered Private Daniel Moore, the dying man who'd said, "Take care of her. She'll get you home." He remembered the British scout's voice, the sandstorm, the long nights fixing the engine while the world burned around him. One evening, Dieter sat beside him near the fence. "You still thinking about that damn jeep?" Hans nodded. "It's strange. We fought over everything, land, flags, pride, and in the end, we all trusted the same machine." Dieter smirked. "Maybe that's the only thing we ever got right." They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that hides sorrow. Above them, the desert sky burned orange as the sun sank behind the dunes. The same sky, no matter which side of the war you stood on. Months later, the Americans shipped most prisoners back to Europe. The Jeep stayed behind. It would go on to serve with a new unit, fresh paint, new numbers, new hands on the wheel. The soldiers who drove it never knew the full story, how it had crossed enemy lines, saved lives, carried ghosts. Years later, after the war, an American mechanic restoring old military vehicles in Texas came across one particular Jeep. Its chassis number traced back to North Africa, 1942. Inside the glove box, he found something odd, a folded piece of paper, yellowed with time. On it was a line in neat German handwriting. Machines remember what men forget. Hans Becker, 1943. The mechanic stared at it for a long time, then gently placed it back. The camera would linger on the Jeep, the same one that crossed the desert, carried enemies, and outlived them all. Its engine purrs softly, steady as a heartbeat. A machine built for war. A relic of survival. A witness to the simple truth Hans had learned too late. That in war, men build machines to endure what they themselves cannot.